ultimately I'd like it to become building code. Like even if it destroyed us as a business, I think that's ultimately what I think needs to happen, and I think it is going to happen. I don't know when, and probably not fast enough, but slowly we're going to approach at least airtightness, making it into the building code at a minimum.
Welcome to the Passive House podcast, brought to you by Passive House Accelerator, a catalyst for zero carbon building. For news, inspiration, and connections from all flavors of Passive House, check out passivehouseaccelerator.com. Sign up to receive regular updates about events, get your questions answered, and contribute to the community dialogue. There's loads of free information for experienced professionals and people just starting out on their Passive House journey. We hope to see you at one of our weekly Passive House Accelerator live webinars. You can also check out our Reimagined Buildings YouTube channel for some great inspiration for both building new or renovating. In the meantime, here's this week's Passive House podcast.
Welcome back to the Passive House podcast. I'm Matthew Cutler-Welsh, coming to you from Tamaki Makaurau in Auckland.
And I'm Zack Semke, coming to you from Seattle, Washington, on the Salish Sea.
The sailors, and you've been out sailing on the sea.
I have been sailing on the Salish Sea. I just took a 2-day course offered by the American Sailing Association, with a 101 course for keel boats. So that was fun. I grew up on round boats. Both my dad and stepdad had small sailboats that that I got to be on the Salish Sea as a kid, but never. I am not a competent sailor, so it was really great to do that in the last couple of days.
Well, it's pretty. It is a pretty beautiful part of the world. I don't think I've been sailing in Seattle. I have been sailing up in Puget Sound out of Anacortes, which is amazing.
Yeah,
it's a pretty stunning part of the world.
Yeah, it is. It is. Yeah.
And
it seems like a shame not to take advantage of it on a boat.
Yeah. But, your boats, it's good to know someone with a boat.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, I am not an owner of a boat.
The best,
I will be renting boats.
The best boat is one that somebody else owns.
Yes, definitely.
And pays to maintain.
Yeah.
And of course, Auckland is known as the city of sails. So there's a lot of sailing goes on here. We're pretty well known for sailing in this part of the world. Although I have to admit, I don't spend as much time on the water as I'd like to, and my kids are a bit deprived in that department.
Yeah, I can relate.
But very, very cool. But we've got a great interview to go over and listen to this week. I really enjoyed listening to this, all about standard plans for passive houses out of Canada, which look forward to getting into that. But before we do, we've got a few people to say thanks to.
Indeed, a big thank you to our founding sponsors, 475 High Performance Building Supply, Baxt Ingui Architects, Glavel, Minutair, Mitsubishi Electric Train HVAC US, Partel, Rockwell North America, Stocorp, and Zola Windows. Thanks also to our champion sponsors, Bewizo, Gradient, Icon Windows and Doors, Intelligent Membranes, PH Air Seal, Proseco, and Source 2050. And a big thank you to our stakeholder partner, NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority.
All right. Well, do you want to tell us about your guest this week, Zach?
Yeah, so I had the chance to talk with Mike Anderson, who's one of the leaders at Passive Design Solutions. And as you mentioned, a big part of their business is this catalog of stock plans for passive house homes that they've created. And so, I mean, we go into more depth on his background and stuff, so I don't think I need to kind of repeat that, but it was a fun conversation exploring a new model for scaling up passive buildings.
Awesome. All right, well, let's get straight into it.
Welcome, Mike Anderson, to the Passive House podcast. It's great to have you here. You are the CEO and design leader at Passive Design Solutions, and Passive Design Solutions has been featured a number of times on the Passive House Accelerator platform. Natalie Leonard did a couple of really great presentations for the Passive House Project Showcase a couple of years ago. Some listeners are, I think, familiar with the firm and your work, but I was hoping that maybe we could start with just a moment for you to introduce yourself to listeners. Maybe talk a little bit about how you got involved in all this, how you got into architecture and your pathway to your role there at Passive Design Solutions.
I came to architecture from an environmental perspective. I have an earlier degree in physics and was working in a physics lab as a young, 20-something in Vancouver, in Canada, and left that to start installing solar hot water systems on condos. I was ready for a change and got into that. And it turns out you can take a pay cut, but it's pretty hard to take a power cut. And going to the bottom rung of basically what was a plumbing installation company was pretty hard. And even though I really believed in the work that we were doing, it just felt like there was lower hanging fruit even than solar hot water, which at the time, before heat pumps were as good as they are now. So it was great technology, but it just really felt like, we were just barely skimming the surface of what needed to happen. And saw a friend of mine who had actually just been accepted to architecture school. And he was like, "Hey, I'm going to architecture school. You should come." And he talked me into putting together an application. And for some reason, they accepted me, which was crazy because I can't draw and had never taken an art class in my life. Very, physics rigid kind of mindset. And he ended up not going and I ended up going.
Oh, funny.
So, so when I got out of architecture school, it was time for me to look for work. And I had heard of Natalie from friends. And I started working from her. She was very hesitant about hiring me and spent a lot of the first couple of years of us working together saying, "What the heck did they teach you in architecture school?" But we ended up, working together, and we've been working together for over a decade now.
Yeah, right.
And my entire architectural career has been in Passive House. I've actually never designed until recently a code house. We've ended up doing one or two.
Wow, right.
Just because we have a relationship with the developer who doesn't think it's the right situation for a particular project. But
right.
Yeah. And so that's where we came at it. The physics background is useful for sure when it comes to energy modeling, which was a lot of what I kind of started doing with Natalie, and a certain approach to problem solving. But the environmental piece has always been core to me doing this work at all. It's really why I'm interested in designing in the first place.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and the firm's interesting because I was Natalie's first employee. She never had one in any business or career before, and from there, we used to be a design build firm, so we were building houses and really only designing 3 a year or something, and then building them. And over time, it became clear that we could be having a bigger impact by leveraging our kind of design and details and working with other people. And that is great, but all of a sudden we're not making builder type money off of every project. We're making designer type money off of every project. And it became really clear that we needed to be doing more projects in order to have a viable business. And out of that's where the idea for stock plans really came from. It was like, okay, how can we be filling a different sort of space here that's a little bit less niche? Nova Scotia, which is where our business is based and where almost the whole team lives, Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, is a pretty low cost market traditionally. The last couple of years since COVID have changed it a little bit. But, homes were selling for a lot less and still sell for a lot less than other parts of Canada or North America. And so, we're really having to compete on price, and lowering design cost is that entry price that people can't get a mortgage for. And we just find it gets a lot more people in the door and starting to think about a high performance home.
Right.
And then most recently, we were really lucky to get a very clever friend of mine, someone who I went to school with, went to architecture school with, Molly Merriman, who's an architect. She has a license, and that enabled us to start working on some bigger projects. So the firm started to move into doing especially affordable housing, because there's a lot of noise about it. It's having a bit of a moment, and there's some good funding available in Canada right now, different levels of government for affordable. And it's really interesting to see how the people who are making the decisions in the nonprofit space are starting to see net zero as a critical piece of affordability. So that's something new that the firm's moving into, and which I think is really exciting work as well.
Well, there's so much to dive into here. So maybe we start with that last point first, into like the affordability and net zero. And so what are you seeing in terms of the economics of passive house and net zero buildings in terms of energy cost, and how is that playing out for homeowners?
Yeah. So a lot of the affordable work that we're doing right now is what we call deeply affordable. So this is not like the rent's reasonable. It's like the rent is incredibly low, because the people who are living there are people who are at risk of homelessness.
Got it.
And
for the affordable housing projects.
Yeah, exactly. And so, that plays out a little differently in every jurisdiction, depending on how the regulations work and who the housing bodies are. But essentially, one of the projects that we completed a couple of years ago, the rent's in the region of about $300 a month.
Wow.
These are for 2 and 3 bedroom townhouses. So that's low enough rent that if you were paying an electricity bill, these are all electric homes because that's what we need to do for the environment. So if you're going to be paying an electricity bill at $250 or $300 a month, your energy bill is eating up most of it. You barely have enough to cover maintenance on the lawn after that. In order to maintain those rents over a long period of time, there has to be no energy bill.
Right.
You have to be able to put all of that into maintenance. Otherwise, the project just isn't financially viable at all. So that was kind of the first interesting inkling where I was like, whoa, wait, like this isn't just like this math works out just as well when you're looking at, okay, I can afford a little bit more on my mortgage, kind of a normal single family type calculus or calculation. Then that's the same for people at the very low end of the income bracket as well, where it's subsidized. You still really, if you can get rid of that energy bill, it makes a lot of things possible. So that was really, really exciting for us. And what we're seeing is that based on the success of that project, some of the more kind of mixed market rent projects are seeing the same thing. They're like, oh, wait, if we include rents, we can charge a little more to our market rent units, and that allows us to subsidize these affordable rent units in the same project because it's all net zero. It just makes it much, much easier for someone to have consistency and predictability in their financing models moving forward.
Makes sense. So for these very affordable projects, what's the building type? These are like garden style apartments, or?
Yeah, great question. So generally we've been doing townhouses. For a couple of reasons that we'll get into that are a little bit more technical. We are starting to get into more apartment style, so like an interior hallway, a double loaded hallway with units on either side. The advantage to townhouses is a couple of things. One, you cut down on the wasted space, right? The corridor is wasted space. It has the staircases. And there's just a certain number of things that you can strip out of a project if everyone has their own front door. It ends up saving enough square footage that debatably it's a little cheaper just on its own. It depends on the scale of the project, of course, and how many units we're talking about. But there's an argument to be made there for townhouses being a little bit cheaper because they're smaller. The real reason, though, that I'm very attached to them is because of cooling. So where we are in Nova Scotia, it's possible to eliminate cooling. It's tricky, but it's possible. But it only becomes possible if we've got good cross ventilation. If you can't open windows on opposite sides of the building, it's very, very difficult. There are mechanical ways of achieving it, but it's difficult to achieve that passive cooling that we're really looking for. If we can eliminate cooling, as a requirement and can only deal with heating, then it's possible for us to use, a system like a hot water baseboard, and that can cut 100,000, 200,000 out of the mechanical budget for a project, which is really, really nice. As well, this is very different in other climates, but where we are, cooling's kind of a new thing. Now it is getting hotter. And so, almost all of our single family homes, I recommend it because, it's important in a global warming world, but it's also increasing the amount of power that we use in a really interesting way in seasons where we didn't used to have peak electrical loads. We were always heating electrically. That's a big thing. So there's whole, diesel power plants in Halifax that just are there for the winter for all the little electric baseboards to kick on. Now those things are kicking on every once in a while during heat waves as well. And so, if we can design away cooling, there's some real advantages to that. And the townhouse model, because of cross ventilation, is much, much more able to do that than an apartment style.
The societal benefits too are very important. I imagine the wildfire smoke events this year have maybe impacting some thinking.
Yeah, Nova Scotia's funny. We had a terrible wildfire year here, but it's a tiny province, and wildfires are not generally a huge thing. Most of the smoke's been going down to the States.
Yeah, Thanks a lot. Appreciate that.
But it is, it is something that we're talking about a lot more, and it's been, it's been fascinating over the last 10 years or a little more, just to see how climate change mitigation is becoming something that I talk about with like regular people.
Yeah.
Like, that was not something that 10 years ago, we weren't really concerned about wildfire smoke, or if someone brought it up, it was like notable and odd. Now it's everyone is thinking about and thinking about cooling, and low solar gain glass. 10 years ago, it was very rare for me to recommend that. Now I'd say it's 50-50,
right? Where
we say, actually, for this project, it's probably the right thing to do. So, cooling's a really interesting one, because we spent certainly the first 4 or 5 years just relentlessly cooking our clients, because we were so focused on getting rid of the furnace and so interested in, getting the house to heat itself. And now, I just recognize that heat's pretty easy, actually, compared to cooling, which is that's more of an art.
Interesting.
Yeah. Maybe other people disagree with me on this, but the fact that the PHPP and WUFI are so bad at cooling doesn't really help either. The energy modeling tool is not as good at predicting cooling from my perspective. So,
and so that brings up the question of like PHI and FEDA certification. Are you doing both on different kind of using both?
The truth is, we're doing a lot less in the last few years than we did early on. Early on when we were working, it was before the FIAS standard was different than the PHI standard. So we were certifying to the PHI standard, although it was through FIAS. The climate adjusted standard, I think, is excellent. I, with certain exceptions based on climate, will try and convince clients to go that way almost all the time. But the FIAS standard has its own idiosyncrasies that are sort of frustrating from a Canadian perspective. There are just certain kind of corollary standards that you have to comply with that make it a little bit, it's just harder for Canada. It's not really designed for that. And and Passive House Canada does the PHI standard, which is geographically 95% of the country or more. It is grueling to impossible to hit that standard. From my perspective, it's just not cost effectively doable. Now, if you're building in BC, the Lower Mainland, Victoria, sure, do it. It's a great standard for that climate. So I like it, and I think that the same strategies apply. But the reality is that the price of solar is changing so rapidly that, I'm finding, even from year to year, the right level to take a project to, it's not just based on geometry or occupancy. It's also like, how much are they charging for solar in your area? because it's just always a moving target where we want to aim for. And of course, the project goals, whether that's, net zero or certification, or, hey, we're just looking for a good house. What's the client looking for? So,
right. One of the things that themes that I think comes through both in your story, your personal story about that experience with the solar hot water company, and also with the early days of being design build, is about scale, is this desire to be scaling up, this transition to get passive buildings, buildings that can respond to climate change, be resilient to climate change. So with these, and I know that you also have kind of some sensibilities around pocket neighborhoods, and how these townhouses and apartments fit into that. So how is, like, do you have, like, what's your vision for uptake of passive design in a rapidly scalable way at the kind of that neighborhood scale?
Yeah, well, I mean, ultimately, I'd like it to become building code. Like, even if it destroyed us as a business, I think that's ultimately what I think needs to happen. And I think it is going to happen. I don't know when, and probably not fast enough, but slowly we're going to approach at least airtightness, making it into the building code at a minimum. And then, I think from that point, there's just short hops to increasing the amount of R value you need, and triple glazing.
Right.
So I mean, that's ultimately what I would really like to see. But notwithstanding that, our company vision is being able to make Passive House accessible to everyone. And that's kind of Passive House with a small p and a small h, right? Like the strategies and the approach and the mentality and the comfort, right? That every house can do that. And as a part of that, it's about making the details easy and affordable and buildable and not threatening to builders or to clients. But it's also about making the projects inspiring in ways that I think it's really important that projects be beautiful and like hot and magazine worthy, and that's cool. But in my experience, most like normal people don't really care all that much about modern architecture. Frankly, they're just not that turned on by it. And I think it's much more important that we kind of touch on things that are a little bit more exciting to the broad public. And I think pocket neighborhoods are one of those things, actually. Like, everybody loves their car and wants, like, they might think cars are terrible for everyone else, but they want their car to be close to their house. And if you can design pocket neighborhoods that kind of address that in a more meaningful way, that kind of challenge the suburban attached garage way of addressing that, but say, actually, there's other benefits to living in this neighborhood that offset you not having an attached garage that you still love. Like, it's close enough and it's convenient enough, but you actually have connection to your neighbors and you're happy to have your kids go outside in the backyard, and all of these things that a pocket neighborhood can offer. But also, I feel like just a certain kind of humble attractiveness, like a blending in with the neighborhood type quality. I think those things are really important as well for Passive House.
Yeah. Well, I have your the Passive Design Solutions Passive House Home Building Plans page open now, and we'll include a link to this in the show notes so people can view these plans themselves. But as you're describing, maybe modern architecture, it doesn't have kind of mass appeal, or there's certainly a big audience or a big market for folks who are looking for more traditional design. I think that's what a lot of these designs are showing. They don't scream out modern, uber sustainable home, and there's something wacky about these, or they look like homes that could have, been designed decades ago, in the 20s, for example, for some of them. So
yeah, and a lot of that, I mean, we get a hilarious range of responses from the stock plans, like everything from people being like, it's just exactly what I was looking for. I can't imagine it being more perfect. To I was interacting with a guy here in town who was like, I think it's really interesting, but do you have anything that like isn't ugly? I guess
yes,
no.
I see them right here.
Yeah. So,
absolutely.
So it's a bit of a wide range. There are certain things, that really drive those stock plans, and it would be hard for anyone else to really see this, but as someone who's been involved in all of them from the beginning, I see distinct generations where the very earliest ones, where it was really just me and Natalie at the kitchen table, I mean, they are cost and like value engineered to the extreme. Like Natalie is like, it has to be able to have vinyl siding on it. If it can't have vinyl siding on it, it's too expensive.
Right.
So, that's kind of one generation. And then over time, we've kind of started to break certain rules and be like, okay, well, what if it did have a half a basement? Is it really that much more expensive? So, we started to kind of challenge ourselves and break a few more rules. But at its core, compact shapes, simple roofs, fewer larger openings, these simple design rules. And when you put those on, what's really interesting is you start seeing something that looks an awful lot like a fairly modest house from 100 years ago. And, I'm not talking about like the Victorian turret ones, because those are cool too. But like, kind of like the Cape Cods and the salt boxes and these, very simple farmhouses before generations of people had added enough additions for them to be what people now call a farmhouse, So, that kind of simplicity is very cost effective. It's very energy efficient. It's easy for people to carry off. And it means that builders will often kind of look at our plans and be like, well, the double stud wall is freaky and weird, but at least there's only a one gable roof. So truss factor is going to be, and they can kind of swallow that, like, okay, the framing cost is going to be twice what I normally would expect, but the truss back just so cheap it kind of offsets it and will make it work. So if you can make them simple enough, it really helps. And the other thing is size. When we started doing this, I was throwing out $200 a square foot as kind of a normal number, and then it was $250, and then it was $300, and now it's like $350, and even $350 is like, you're not getting fancy finishes, right? Like it's pretty bare bones. And when you do the math with people, they're like, my God, that means this 2,000 square foot house is $700,000. Like, how did that happen? And I'm like, that doesn't even include, that doesn't include a screen porch. Like
right. And we're talking Canadian dollars too.
We're talking Canadian dollars. Yeah, that's right. And the numbers are the numbers are definitely different across the border, although I find more variety within regions.
Yeah.
Like,
sure.
I mean, in Canada, but especially in the States, like among the regions.
Seattle it's just so ridiculously high in Seattle. It's just,
like you might be $450 as a floor. And going up from there. Right.
Oh, so, no, it's,
So, it just has meant that when I'm talking with people who have, what I think is kind of a normal person budget, like $500,000, like if you have $500,000 to be able to get you a house, well, what that's getting you is like maybe a 1,500 square foot slab on grade bungalow.
Right.
Like you just are not getting a whole lot of bang for your buck. And so for that reason, the stock plans were really focusing on small, like 1,500 square feet and even less.
Yeah.
So we can get someone who's looking to downsize into something that's good, age in place, one level living, simple, humble, everything you need, and no heating bill, right?
Right. Right.
Like when you take passive as a given, like it's not like I'm trying to I never have to try and talk anyone in energy efficiency, or very rarely do I ever have to talk anyone in energy efficiency. If they called us, they already drank the Kool-Aid.
Right.
So then it's about getting them in something that they can afford, because given that our niche is passive, it doesn't mean that people who are calling are fancy. They're like all over the map financially. And a lot of people who are calling are do-it-yourselfers. They have, $250,000 and they're like, I want to build a house for me and my kids, and I've got the time right now. And so, there's a lot of that. It's like, okay, simple, small, compact, right? How can we get this going? And that's what's driven those stock plans more than anything else. And then, getting them to look a certain way is, that just comes after everything else.
Yeah. So how does the process work if somebody wants to use the stock plans, and what kind of engagement in like customizing or not customizing?
Yeah.
Like how does that work? Walk us through that.
Yeah. So it's a great question, and it's like, I'm quite proud of the process, really. Like, even more so than the catalog, which is neat and which has grown over the years. It's really the process that is actually valuable from my perspective. And what we've done is basically, it's the same level of customization as a custom design, but instead of having like a meeting every 2 weeks for 6 months, as you go through absolutely every possible option, there are 3 meetings. And the first one is a design phase. So we bring people in. We do charge a small fee because there's a lot of people who in the early days would call and be like, oh, no, I'm not looking to build a house. I just think it's really cool. And it's like, why are we
great? That's nice, but
yeah. So we charge a small fee to get rid of tire kickers. What it did is refunded if someone signs a contract. And then we just hang out and talk and get to have an idea of the site. The site's critical, of course. It's the site that picks the plan more than what people think they want. Because we've got to make sure that it's oriented right, the front door is in the right place, and obviously windows are in the right place and all that good stuff. Views is taken into account, everything, right? We want to pick the right basic plan. Then during that meeting, we'll say, okay, well, how many people are in the house, and are you going to be there all the time? Just trying to figure out enough about their life that we get a really good idea of the program. Ideally, coming into that meeting, we'd also be like, cool, you want a tub and, like little details too. Move this wall because I want a bigger room. But sometimes it's just, generally, who are you and what's your site? What basic plan do I think is the best, or do we think is the best, and go on from there. Then we would do a bunch of baseline modifications. So certainly everything we've discussed and everything that we think needs to go in order to make it perform the way that works for your lifestyle. So that's passive house stuff, but it's also, if the front door needs to move, and we would discuss that at the console. Okay. The base plan is a certain amount of money. The modifications are hourly on top of that.
Got it.
In the contract, it's capped, right? It's a fixed price contract in the sense that I say it's 20 to 40 hours. If it takes 45 hours, then it's 40 hours. That's what the contract says. Because there has to be some security for people. Otherwise, it's just impossible for them to say, okay.
Right.
So then we would get together. Zoom's the best thing. We're on it right now.
Yep.
Zoom's like the best thing that happened in the whole pandemic. It's amazing.
Yeah, right. I could imagine that'd be really helpful to you guys.
Great. Yeah. It's meant that now we can basically serve all of North America.
I was just going to ask, can I get one in Seattle?
Yeah. Yes, of course. Yeah. And so the thing that's really cool about it, though, is sharing screen. Love share screen, because it means that people can come with me, seeing what I see. We can go in the model. We use Vectorworks, but Revit, same thing. You can go in and it's like a little dollhouse. It's got little tables and chairs. It's got light fixtures and sinks. And it's given how we started, which was that you basically had to teach a client how to read drawings enough to share the drawings with them.
Yeah.
And now it's like they don't need to know any of that.
Yeah.
They're just in the house. And if they want to move a window, we just do it live. Because it doesn't take that long to do this stuff. Once you're starting with a plan that's already a dollhouse, if we're moving the wall around, it's easy. Yeah. So the tool of Zoom and the tool of Vectorworks, like the BIM model of drafting, have just kind of glommed together so that people can just come with us on the journey. And we do whatever we need to get ready for it, but then we can make whatever tweaks we need to, or just after the meeting, and send out a new set. And then that's the second meeting. And then the third meeting is like getting into details, like electrical, schematics, or the light switches and switches. How is the mechanical system working? Which in some houses is simple and in some houses is complex. And then just also walking through the house again and checking it out. And that's it.
Yeah.
That's all it takes. Sometimes it takes a fourth meeting, but like it just doesn't take
Right.
that. And
Right.
the difference is that when you're doing a true custom design, starting from, starting from the site, effectively from the site and the people, it's not like you're starting from nothing, but like, there's nothing drawn. It takes a really long time just to get to the point where you even have a dollhouse you can walk around.
Oh yeah,
And
I have.
move the
Yeah.
dogs,
Mhm.
right. So the stock plan process just slashes, 3 months, 4 months off of the beginning of that process and gets us really quickly into a point where we're like, okay, now all we got to do is get your sign off and do some condocs. And we've got some really clever, drafting techs who can pound through a house in a couple of days. Because and the stock plans are really interesting because you realize, like, we've got, I don't know, 40 or something, or ish. And I would say that of those 40, probably 10, maybe even 15 have never sold. No one's bought them. And I get people calling, people call and be like, I'm interested in an Inverness. And it's like, yeah, you think you are. No one's ever bought that. I don't know why. But you really
There's a reason.
Yeah. I don't know what it is, but there's a reason nobody's bought this. And what you probably want is this one, because that's what everyone who says they want an Inverness end up buying in the end.
Yeah, that's funny.
Yeah, it is. It is. And so it's certain plans, Red Island, Black Rock, and there's a few that we've sold, 10 times each. And that means that when I get to call up Liz, or Zach, my trusty techs, I can say, oh, it's a Black Rock, and they're like, oh yeah, cool. They did one 2 weeks ago.
Right.
So it's gotten us to a place where this year's a little bit slower because of interest rates and whatever. But certainly last year, and probably for the second half of this year, we'll be doing about a house a week.
Wow.
And that's on top of apartment buildings.
That's so cool.
So
I was just, that is so, thank you for that walkthrough. It's really fascinating and compelling in terms of, like, it seems like it does solve a lot of pain points for people. And so with that kind of, there's this balance between the stock plan houses and the apartments, buildings, and the custom building design that you guys do. What's the basic, like, is it 50-50 in terms of volume of work that you are doing, or what's the balance?
It depends on the year. Different years are different. This year is pretty heavy on the apartment side, just because there's just a lot of affordable housing work going on. Yeah. And interest rates are high. So it's been a little slow for the last 6 months or 8 months. I'd say.
Yeah, I know. It's a weird time right now.
Yeah, it's a weird time.
Yeah.
And custom has been incredibly slow for us. Just like I think we signed one a couple of weeks ago, and that was the first one in months. So, and that's fine. I love custom design, but stock plans are so quick and so easy. And as you get more and more plans up, the funny thing about custom is that we end up going through it, then I'm like, sort of ended up looking like a blah. Like
right. You could have started that way.
Actually,
That's
because
interesting.
Like, let's face it, there's really only, especially in houses. I mean, you get to bigger scales, of course, everything's different. But when you get to houses, there's only so many ways you're going to move around a great room and a bedroom chunk. Like if you think of things in terms of partie, which was how I was taught at architecture school, think about stuff. So like, what's the 1 second sketch of a house where it's like, here's all your other stuff, and then here's the great room, right? Can you tell the whole story of the house in just like that 1 second sketch? If you look at houses that way, there's like 20 options. That's it. And it reappears at different scales, but basically that's the partie. And so it's, it's funny because if you squint your eyes at a house long enough, even the custom designs, it's like, it's kind of like, it's sort of like this one, isn't it?
Right. Yeah.
And we could have got there maybe with modification, but a lot of people just really want to come on the journey, right? They want to design their own home is what it is. And we're just help, we're like advice and drafting support, and they're designing. And it's awesome. Like that part's the fun part, because you really get to know people, and you're like half marriage counselor,
right,
half psychic. But yeah, so custom design has been slow, but other than that, I'd say that certainly stock plans are half our work in a given year. It's 50%, and then the rest is between single family and multifamily projects, energy consulting, all that other good stuff.
Right. And if you're in North America, you are, and listening to this, then this is an option for you. Sounds like.
We don't. I won't do hot climates.
Mhm.
So, and it's not because we couldn't. In like people have called from like Georgia and Florida and stuff. It's just I just don't know anything about them. Like I've lived my whole life in Canada. I just know I understand
Yeah.
cold climates. I understand the northern hemisphere, and unless they like I just think working in the south would be weird,
Yeah.
Texas and stuff.
Yeah.
We have worked in Colorado. That's about as hot as we've gotten,
Mhm.
and even that energy modeling it's just a total mind shift.
Yeah.
Completely
Sure.
different looking and thinking about things. So, yeah.
Mhm. And I know that things are a little bit weird now or very weird because of the interest rate situation. But I mean, what has been your what's your impression of what's happening in terms of demand for passive buildings, passive design?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I certainly think that the problems that passive buildings solve are problems more people are aware of, if that makes sense. Now, I don't think that the mass market is necessarily aware that passive design is a solution to them unless
Right.
they get into it. Like, if you're a real researcher and you're building a home, okay. But, like the average person who's moving into an apartment has maybe never heard of it. And
Mhm.
like, well, I just, someone sent me a link to a real estate listing for one of the houses we designed, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago. And I was looking at the real estate listing. It didn't mention passive house at all. This is like,
right.
and it's like, it must have an energy bill of like maybe $800 a year for everything, like heating, cooling, fridge, TV, everything.
Mhm.
And there's nothing about it in there. And from that, I take that, definitely they're talking about the fact that energy bills are low and you should see them, but they're not mentioning passive house. And I think that outside of the communities that are really excited about this and know about this, it's better to talk about net zero. That's just a much simpler concept for people to wrap their mind around. You don't get into it instantly nitty-gritty distinctions between different standards and what is ACH versus CFM. It's
Yeah.
There's a lot of technical meaning to passive house that gets stripped away in something like net zero. And so that tends to be how I talk to people if I know they're not if I know they don't know.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Right. Yeah.
But I think that that's not to say that passive buildings aren't the way you get there. I think it's the only reasonable way to get there.
Yeah.
But like your average person moving into an apartment building, if they know it's net zero, that's all they need to know.
Yeah. Right. It's
we can keep it as we can keep it in the club how we actually need it happen to some extent.
Right. No, that makes sense. And you don't even need to go into there's the minutia of what's the right target anyway. Does it? Yeah. It should be net zero. All of that is it's just it's more just what can people understand really quickly and be compelled by.
That's right. That's right. And people are talking more about net zero carbon as well, which I think is really interesting because it starts to pull in the embodied energy, which operational energy kind of swamps embodied energy, truthfully. But like it's just I just can't help but feel that like we really have to change the way we're using materials too, notwithstanding that like everything should be able to have vinyl just from a cost perspective and to make it mainstream. But like, at some point we just got to stop doing that. And it can't happen soon enough from my perspective. And I just really want to see people start pulling in a little bit more holistic stuff, and passive house, which I love and which I've devoted my career to, and I think the PhD is incredible. It's a beautiful piece of mathematics. Like it, it's just one piece, right? It's not the whole puzzle. It's a really clever tool we use to solve certain problems, but we've got a huge range of problems to solve. And I just feel like we need to come up with some really great terminology that's about addressing all of them to the best of your ability, and whatever tool you use depends on your specialty and background.
You're here. Well said, Mike. This has really been a very fun conversation. I really appreciate your time and keep up the good work.
Right on. Well, thanks, Zach, and get in touch if you want a house in Seattle.
I will. Thank you.
Cool. Talk to you soon.
And that was Mike Anderson of Passive Design Solutions. Great chats. I think I don't know how many people we've spoken to, Zach, that have pretty much only done Passive House in their professional career. That's quite impressive, and he's been doing it for over 10 years.
Yeah,
that's pretty amazing.
Right. And I mean, he was like, this is why I'm doing architecture. This, and I think a lot of people probably can relate to that. A few folks have had the pleasure of just exclusively focusing on it. So yeah, it's pretty great stuff.
Yeah, because we've spoken to lots of people who sort of came through architecture, then wanted to do something sustainable, got into lead maybe, and then eventually found Passive House. But to go into architecture knowing about Passive House already, that's pretty exciting for a future generation of designers. But this is kind of really shifting the idea away from bespoke design of every single building, and really heavy input from architects, lots of meetings, sort of spinning that on its head and saying, well, how can we just have 3 meetings, just 3 design meetings, and accepting that those standard designs are always going to need a little bit of tweaking. And I think this is where the concept of standard plans gets a little bit misunderstood, because that's the reality, is that it's very rare that you just take a plan and just plonk it on a piece of land. There is going to be some tweaking, but it's really interesting hearing that even when they do custom design, they very often end up back at something that looks very similar to one of their standard plans, which kind of makes me think that there's a limited number of iterations of good design.
Right. Nothing new under the sun. But
at least simple design. I mean, if you want to go massively grand and bespoke, that's a different thing.
I think this is another interesting application of this idea that when we repeat something, we learn, right? Because he was talking about how there are some designs that have been done, or some designs that have been selected 10 times or more, and it becomes a little bit of, this is a familiar territory for the people who are working on them. And so then also when they have conversations about how to customize those designs, there's a kind of a already a vocabulary or kind of set of solutions that they've applied and worked with. So all of those kind of learnings help make that process quicker and therefore cheaper. So it's really unique.
Yeah, unique in its repeatability.
Right. I guess I should say it's really unique as an approach. Like their approach is very, very fresh and different from, I think, most firms' approach.
Yeah, which is, I guess, the challenge for an architect is because it's a little bit against what you're selling as an architect, which is your flair and your design and your input. And this is saying, well, how about we do all that up front and then take some of the architecture out of the overall cost and out of the picture, which in some ways obviously makes them more attractive to clientele, because it's a reduced cost, but they're getting a great product at the end of it. So it might be a little bit counterintuitive, but it's obviously working. They're in demand. They're doing some great work and putting a lot of houses on the ground. Right at the beginning of the conversation, Mike talks about wanting to have more influence and transitioning from a design build firm to a design company, and then realizing that to make that viable for them, they need to increase volume. One common thread that we often hear from our guests is that desire to have an influence and realigning their business or changing path for that purpose, and asking that question, how can I have most impact on what I do? Not how can we make more money, which interestingly often follows, but we've heard that many times through multiple guests in the past is what can I do to make what I do more accessible, have more influence? And obviously, that's how they're doing that. But they're also niching down. You talked at the end about how they've recognised that they work really well in cold climates.
Mm-hmm.
I would love to have this sort of thing. We need this in warmer climates where I am, and probably further south in the States as well.
Right, and that was he was very clear that wasn't because it couldn't be done, but just that their expertise lies elsewhere. So that's where they're focusing on.
Yeah, their expertise lies elsewhere, and also an interesting conversation there around modelling and the benefits of PHPP in cold climates. But also, this has been acknowledged by a few people that doing modelling for cooling is hard. It's not as easy to make a house work in warmer climates with standard passive house approaches. So that's a challenge that people are grappling with, and I'm really excited. The FierceCon being in Texas this year,
yeah,
taking it right to where those issues are very real. There's a lot of smart people thinking about how to do passive house, how to do low energy buildings in warm climates.
Then that gets to the kind of the theme of evolution of as we discover problems like overheating in passive house, evolving and innovating to address those as practitioners and as standards, and then also like he alluded to the question about balancing how far you go with, given that the solar panel cost is going down, and so therefore how far you go, like what's the optimal place to pin that in terms of the energy efficiency piece. And I think that just also underlines the fact that we're in this big transition where with all these different moving pieces in decarbonizing our economies and our energy. And as that happens, we're going to be the optimal solution for buildings is going to be changing and evolving over time in terms of cost and decarbonization. So it's I think good to acknowledge that, and also I think it's fun that's the case, because we're going to be having interesting, tricky problems to address and answer for years as this all unfolds.
The whole construct of the concept of energy modeling, carbon modeling, particularly around embodied carbon, I think is becoming really, really interesting. There's a post that was bouncing around this week, and I think Shannon Pelleton linked to it on LinkedIn about deep retrofits, and it talked about the use of life cycle analysis and embodied carbon as a really useful tool for figuring out not just the cost effectiveness, but the true full cost benefit of deep energy retrofits. And I think the similar concept there for things like solar panels. It's very easy for us to say, we should focus on efficiency first, which I think is still absolutely true. Still need to get the envelope working. PV doesn't make a house more energy efficient. It just is a different way to get your electrons. So you still want to do energy efficiency first, but I think that's a really interesting idea to keep in our mind, that we don't have this fixed paradigm of insulation good, PV panels bad.
Definitely.
But it's a moving target, because as costs come down, as efficiencies increases, as efficiency of production improves, you get better recyclability and circular economy. The whole thing is constantly evolving, and I think there's a risk that we lock ourselves into one way of thinking without reassessing that quite regularly to say, okay, where do things stack up now? And I also think that embodied carbon is a really useful tool for doing that, because it allows you to sort of put things in a an equivalent metric, which is CO2 equivalents per square meter, or similar. And then you can compare things, apples and apples. Whereas that was very difficult to do in the past. It's like, well, you've got all these variables on one side of the equation, different variables on the other. So I'm excited to see that as a sort of consequence of people getting involved in embodied carbon and life cycle analysis. It's going to allow much better decision making that goes beyond just how much it's going to cost.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And what you just said raises two things. And one is that there's also so much that we need to learn about the actual embodied carbon of materials. And I think there's been tons of work that's been happening. I think that's ratcheting up more and more, which is really great. I mean, we've been thinking about energy efficiency and carbon for decades now, and the world of embodied carbon it's much newer. And so I think that there's a lot more learning and discovery that needs to happen, and also like figuring out how to make sure that manufacturers are being forthright about that information about carbon. There's just this really kind of interesting and in some ways sobering report from the World Resources Institute that was really questioning the carbon sequestration potential of mass timber, and I'll link to it in the show notes. And so that was just and it has to do with like how much of the tree is left and wood is left left to rot after in the forest after harvest, how much is lost during the production, milling of the wood, and those kinds of questions. Are like 5 different key elements that led to the World Resources Institute's conclusion that actually, except in very specific circumstances, it may be that mass timber is as carbon intensive as even steel and concrete, which is crazy. So, I think I'm not saying I'm not staking a flag anywhere here, but just to point out that there are very serious people who care deeply about decarbonization, who are having really different understandings of the implications of these different materials. And so there's just, it underscores how important it is for us to learn more and figure out what the implications are. So there's that. And then the other piece is the question about heat pumps and decarbonizing of heat, and the relationship between that and making our envelopes more efficient so that we're decreasing demand. And so one of the questions that we have in the broader decarbonization of buildings world is, where is the right place? At what point are we going too far with one or the other? Where's the optimal balance of decreasing demand through the building envelope versus decreasing carbon intensity of heat? And so like I say, we're never going to be bored.
That's right. One other thing that I thought was really useful was how Passive House gets marketed. I'm always interested in this, and so we sort of geek out on that. But he mentioned that he thought the concept of net zero was more marketable, and that he gave that example of a house selling recently, and it wasn't even noted that it was a passive house. It was just, there was some comment about having low energy bills. And I think that's a really useful point for us who are in the tent. And we sometimes, I know for myself, I sometimes get frustrated that people just don't get the value of passive house. So I think that's interesting, kind of stepping back from that and saying, okay, well, what does motivate people? And that concept of net zero is a bit probably more useful explaining what the benefits are. It's a bit more of a descriptive term that people can kind of get their head around. And if we were to take Passive House to a marketing company, they probably wouldn't call it Passive House. So
right.
I think that's useful for us. And coming back to the concept of having house plans, a book of house plans that that you can see, that you can, he talked about being able to walk through them now using Zoom and BIM. I think that always thinking about how we can market the benefits of Passive House is really useful if we do want to impact more than just the community that's already drunk the Kool-Aid, and and go beyond that and to have a much bigger influence. So I don't know if net zero is the right term. Interested in what's worked for others, but I think that there are ways of talking about what we do to people who have never come across Passive House before that does perhaps make it more appealing.
Yeah, definitely. It's like the perennial question, right? What's the right term? I when I was listening back to the conversation, and listening to myself saying, I agree. There's part of me that totally agrees with what he's saying. And there's other part of me that continues to wonder. So for example, like there's this luxury high-rise residential condo project that's going up in Vancouver, BC, called The Curve. I don't know what the budget of this building is, but it's probably well north of $1 billion, right?
Yeah.
It's high end, and they are choosing to market it with Passive House in their descriptions. So it also is like, how is the brand of Passive House evolving? Like now, like the ship has sailed. It's been out there. We can't erase the fact that it was named Passive House decades ago, right? So it's kind of accrued from marketing speak, it's accrued some value as a brand, some brand equity over time. And so it's beginning. There are also examples in certain markets, like Vancouver, where probably it's more a term that's bandied about more, where it actually, there are some, big dollar marketing budgets that are and experts who are deciding to use it as a selling point. So of course they're talking about health and like technology, I think, and they're breaking it down into its component, like benefits. So it's really interesting.
I mean, I had someone, a family member, text me this week saying that an extended family member has just designed their own Passive House. I have no idea what that means, because I don't know. I'm pretty sure this person has not a very detailed idea of Passive House with capital P, capital H. So when and I've learned that when someone said, or you read an article from just a regular news outlet that says it's passive design or Passive House, no idea what that actually means until you actually. It could be passive solar. It could be airtight. It could be solar panels. So we have to be a little bit wary when we hear that term. Awesome. Hey, really cool stuff. I would love for passive design solutions or an equivalent. I think there's a great opportunity there for someone to run with that same concept in other locations around the place, because it's obviously working well. And I think I can see the benefit of a standard plan concept like that, certainly in this part of the world, and I think plenty of others.
I mean, they're just trailblazers. It's so cool what they're doing. I wish them all the success, and am excited to see that they have been successful with this model.
Nice. All right. So Accelerator Live still on break at the moment?
On break for one more week. We are back on Wednesday, September 6th. So that's Thursday, September 7th for you in New Zealand and Australia. And we're going to be kicking off the new season of Passive House Accelerator Live with a 101 episode of the show, because it's the first Wednesday, and it's going to feature Sean St. Amour speaking about the principle of airtightness. So don't miss it. It's going to be good stuff.
Always a good time with Sean.
Yeah.
Very good. All right. But we'll be back again next week as well on Passive House Podcast. So we'll catch up then.